In 1867, a British settler stood in the middle of an Arizona desert and named a city after a mythological bird that burns itself to death and rises from its own ashes. He did not choose that name because it sounded poetic. He did not choose it because it was memorable or marketable or easy to pronounce. He chose it because of what was underneath his feet. And what was underneath his feet? Hundreds of miles of precisely engineered canals, already built, already aligned, already functional, had no explanation that satisfied him. So he named the city after the only story that fit. Something was here before, something advanced, something gone, and we are rising from its ruins. That name has been said millions of times since 1867. Phoenix. And almost nobody who says it knows what it was actually meant to describe. This is the story of what was underneath. Before we go underground, I want to establish something clearly. This is not a story about aliens. This is not a story about lost continents, or mystical civilizations, or anything that requires you to abandon your critical thinking at the door. This is a story about documented archaeology, about engineering that exists and can be measured, and has been measured. About a man named Duppa who made a specific statement about why he chose a specific name, and about the questions that statement raises, which have never been adequately answered in the century and a half since he made it. The mystery here is not invented. It is built into the name of one of the largest cities in the United States. It has been hiding in plain sight since the day the city was founded. And the reason most people have never heard it is not because the evidence is hidden. It is because nobody thought to read the name as a question. Let us start at the beginning. Not 1867, much earlier, roughly 2,000 years earlier. Because the story of what Duppa found in that desert begins not with settlers, or surveys, or administrative orders, but with water. Specifically, with the problem of water in one of the most arid landscapes on the North American continent. The Salt River Valley, in what is now central Arizona, receives on average 8 inches of rainfall per year. 8 inches. For context, the American national average is about 38 inches. London receives approximately 24. The Sahara Desert receives about 1 inch annually, making the Salt River Valley approximately 8 times wetter than the Sahara, but still profoundly, dangerously, agriculturally challenging dry. You cannot farm in the Salt River Valley without irrigation. This is not a matter of preference or efficiency. It is a physical constraint. If you want to grow food in that landscape, you need water, and you need a system to move it. This is the starting point for everything that follows. Because when Anglo-American settlers arrived in the Salt River Valley in the 1860s and 1870s, they found that the water problem had already been solved. Not partially solved. Not sketched out in preliminary earthworks. Solved. Comprehensively, systematically, at a scale that stunned the engineers who examined it. What they found was a canal system. Not one canal. Not a handful of irrigation ditches. A network. Contemporary surveys conducted in the late 19th century identified approximately 500 miles of primary canals running through the Salt River Valley. 500 miles. Later and more comprehensive archaeological surveys have revised that number upward. Modern estimates place the total extent of the prehistoric canal network in the greater Phoenix Basin at somewhere between 800 and 1,000 miles of engineered waterways. To put that in perspective, the entire length of the Mississippi River from its source in Minnesota to the Gulf of Mexico is approximately 2,300 miles. The canal system beneath Phoenix is roughly half the length of the Mississippi. Built in a desert by people whose identity, whose timeline, whose civilization remains one of the most debated questions in North American archaeology. The official academic answer to the question of who built these canals is the Hohokam. The name comes from the O'odham language, and it means something roughly translatable as those who have gone, or those who have used up. It is a name given to them by others. We do not know what they called themselves. We do not know their language in any comprehensive way. We do not have their written records because we have not identified a writing system associated with them. What we have is their engineering, and their engineering is extraordinary. The Hohokam canal system was not a collection of simple ditches. The primary canals were in some cases 30 feet wide and 10 feet deep. They were aligned with the natural gradient of the landscape with a precision that modern hydrological engineers have described in peer-reviewed literature as sophisticated. The canals maintained consistent slopes across long distances to keep water moving at the right velocity. Too fast, and the canal walls erode. Too slow, and sediment accumulates and blocks the flow. Getting that balance right across hundreds of miles of desert terrain without modern surveying equipment, without GPS, without aerial photography, requires a level of hydraulic engineering knowledge that is not primitive. It is not simple. It represents accumulated expertise developed over generations and applied at a scale that most civilizations in human history never attempted. The Hohokam Canal system at its peak is estimated to have supported a population of somewhere between 50,000 and 100,000 people in the Salt River Valley. Scholars debate the upper number, but the lower number is generally accepted. 50,000 people living in a desert that receives 8 inches of rain per year, fed entirely by an engineered water system that moved the Salt River across the landscape in controlled, measured, agriculturally productive ways. This civilization was not marginal. It was not a sparse collection of nomadic bands scratching subsistence from the desert floor. It was a large, settled, agriculturally sophisticated civilization that occupied the Salt River Valley for somewhere between 1,000 and 1,500 years. By comparison, the United States as a political entity is approximately 250 years old. The Hohokam were in that valley for 6 times longer than America has existed. And then they were gone. Around the middle of the 15th century, approximately 50 years before Columbus reached the Americas, the Hohokam disappeared. Not completely, and not without leaving descendants. The Hohokam people of modern Arizona maintain cultural and likely genetic continuity with the Hohokam. But the civilization as a functioning urban agricultural system collapsed. The population dispersed. The canals were abandoned. The large settlements were left empty. And the desert, which had been held back by 500 years of intensive water management, began to reclaim what had been taken from it. By the time Anglo-American settlers arrived 400 years later, the canals were partially silted, partially overgrown, partially collapsed. But they were still there, still traceable, still, in many sections, still functional, with cleaning. And this is the moment I want you to hold clearly in your mind, because it is the hinge on which this entire story turns. The settlers did not discover canals and then decide to build a city. The settlers discovered canals and decided to use them. They cleaned them out. They reinforced the walls. They diverted the Salt River back into channels that someone else had engineered centuries before. The agricultural foundation of Phoenix, Arizona, the water infrastructure that allowed a modern American city to exist in a desert, was built by a civilization that had been gone for 400 years before the first Anglo settler arrived. The settlers inherited it. They did not build it. They turned on someone else's water. Darrell Duppa understood this. Duppa was not a typical frontier settler. He was an Englishman with a classical education, a man who had read widely and thought carefully, and who brought to the Arizona desert a frame of reference that included the ruins of Rome and Greece and Egypt. When he looked at what was beneath his feet in the Salt River Valley, he did not see primitive earthworks. He saw the infrastructure of a civilization. And when the question arose of what to name the new settlement being built above those ruins, he gave an answer that is worth quoting directly. He said, "The new city should be named Phoenix, because a new city would spring from the ashes of a former civilization." That is not a poetic metaphor loosely applied. That is a precise, specific, deliberate statement. Duppa was saying that what was there before was a civilization. Not a tribe, not a primitive settlement, a civilization. And that the new city was rising from its ashes. He named Phoenix after the prior civilization it was built upon. That name has been the name of a major American city for 150 years. And almost no one who lives there knows what it was meant to describe. Now I want to ask the question that Duppa's statement makes unavoidable. If the Hohokam built 800 to 1,000 miles of precisely engineered irrigation canals, if they supported a population of 50 to 100,000 people in one of the most hostile agricultural environments on the continent, if they sustained this civilization for over 1,000 years, then where is everything else? Engineering at that scale does not exist in isolation. It is the product of a civilization that has solved not just the technical problem of water movement, but also the social problems of labor organization, resource allocation, political governance, and long-term planning across multiple generations. You do not build 500 miles of canals with a disorganized population. You build them with a civilization that has administrators and engineers and record keepers and people whose job it is to maintain institutional knowledge across generations. So where are the administrative records? Where is the evidence of the governance structure sophisticated enough to plan, fund, and execute a 1,000-mile hydraulic network? Where is the population center large enough to house the labor force that built it? Archaeology has identified large Hohokam settlements, Casa Grande, Snaketown, the platform mounds that dot the Salt River Valley. But the ratio between what the engineering implies and what the archaeological record preserves is a gap that Hohokam scholars have been quietly wrestling with for decades. The canals are too sophisticated for the civilization that surrounds them in the documentary record. That is not a fringe claim. That is a tension that appears in the peer-reviewed literature when you read it carefully. The engineering is advanced. The supporting evidence for a civilization advanced enough to produce it is incomplete. And that incompleteness is the question that Duppa was intuiting in 1867 when he named his city after a bird that rises from the ashes of what came before. Now I want to take you beyond Phoenix, because Phoenix is one data point, and one data point is not a pattern. But Phoenix is not alone. Across the American Southwest, across Mexico, across Peru and Bolivia and the Yucatan Peninsula, across Cambodia and Indonesia and the Indus Valley, there is a repeating archaeological situation that looks remarkably like what we find in the Salt River Valley. Infrastructure that exists. Infrastructure that is sophisticated. Infrastructure that implies a level of social and technical organization significantly greater than what the surrounding archaeological record seems to document. Canal systems, road networks, agricultural terracing at scales that strain the standard explanations. And in each case, the official academic response is the same. These people were more sophisticated than we initially assumed. And that answer is correct as far as it goes. The question is whether it goes far enough. Because there is a difference between a civilization that is more sophisticated than assumed and a civilization that built infrastructure so sophisticated that the next civilization to arrive 400 years later simply inherited it without modification. That gap between more sophisticated than assumed and sophisticated enough that successors could not improve upon the system is where the real question lives. Let me bring you back to Phoenix for the final layer of this story, because there is one more piece that I have been saving, and it changes the texture of everything that comes before it. In 2019, archaeologists working in the Phoenix metropolitan area using a technology called LiDAR, light detection and ranging, which uses laser pulses to map terrain through vegetation and surface buildup, identified canal structures beneath the modern city that had not previously been documented. Not traces, not ambiguous earthworks, canal structures, beneath a city of 5 million people. The survey was not comprehensive because comprehensive LiDAR surveys of an entire metropolitan area are extraordinarily expensive. But the sections that were surveyed suggested that the known canal network, already estimated at 800 to 1,000 miles, may be significantly larger than current measurements indicate. Beneath Phoenix, Arizona, there may be more infrastructure than we know about, built by people we do not fully understand, used by settlers who named their city after the mystery of it, and now covered by one of the fastest-growing urban areas in the United States. The ashes are still there. The Phoenix built above them grows larger every year. And somewhere underneath the highways and the subdivisions and the water treatment facilities that pipe Salt River water to 5 million people, the canals run on. Some of them still carrying water. Some of them still doing exactly what they were built to do 1,000 years ago by a civilization that left behind its greatest work and almost nothing else. Duppa looked at that in 1867 and did not pretend to have an answer. He named the city after the question. Phoenix, from the ashes of something prior. Something that built better than we have yet fully understood. Something that was here and then was gone, and left its bones in the desert for the next civilization to stand on. That is not a comfortable story. It does not resolve cleanly. It does not come with a conclusion that the textbooks can file away. But it is the story that the name of the city has been quietly telling for 150 years. And now you know what the name was actually meant to say.